So now let's start talking about this idea of dualism versus non-dualism. And like I was saying a minute ago, this is an important concept to get our minds around, because there's different angles of looking at this. There's different perspectives, and I'm going to take a certain perspective today talking about this, because these are philosophical. You might consider them philosophical and theological, spiritual kind of discussions. And you may think, oh, well, that's, what practical value of this, does this stuff have for me on a daily basis? And I'm gonna bring it home, because those of you who know me pretty well, I'm all about the pragmatic approach. I'm all about practicality, and how does this stuff affect us in a practical, day-to-day way? And so I'm going to talk about these, what some people may consider these philosophical kind of high-level kind of thinking kind of ideas, but I'm going to bring it home and talk about specifically why I think it's important for us to have a fairly rational, but holistic at the same time, but still rational view of these ideas from a common sense standpoint, okay? And not just blindly throw these ideas out there and just kind of make them these wide, far-sweeping concepts without thinking about the implications of how we think about them. That's important, because that affects us, as I said, on a daily basis, on a very practical level. That's why I talk about this stuff. So let's talk about dualism first, what dualism is and what non-dualism is. I'll just very quickly explain, what they are. So this idea of dualism, D-U-A-L-I-S-M, dualism. Well, dual, we know, means two, right? Two of something, dual. So dualism, first of all, it refers to two parts of something. And in the context of what we're talking about, sometimes people will use different phrases to describe this idea of dualism. I'm just going to list them. So they'll talk about good and bad. They'll talk about yin and yang. People will talk about God and creation. If you believe in God, again, you don't have to believe in God. You could be an atheist, and all of these discussions that I have with you all still apply. So it doesn't matter if you believe in God or not. But if you do, then there's God and creation, God in the universe. This is dualism there. Or mind and matter. Just the mind, the physical, and the mental. There's that duality. Okay, so those are phrases and ideas underneath this whole idea of dualism. Okay, so we'll come back to this. But non-dualism, what does that non-dualism? Well, non-dualism means not two, so it's not two. Non-dualism refers to a oneness, generally speaking, when you hear people talking about this. No difference. They talk about this idea of no difference between the relative and the absolute. That's a phrase that they often use. And we used to use that when I taught TM, when I taught Transcendental Meditation. That was a phrase that was used, and it comes out of Vedic teaching. Hinduism is an offshoot of the Vedic teaching, and so does Buddhism. The original roots were Vedic. And then there was a split historically. Again, I don't want to get into all this. You can read this. Other experts have gone into this in much greater detail and with much greater knowledge about it than I have. But the point is, this idea of relative and absolute, what does that mean? That means there's this idea of experiencing the self and the non-self. They sometimes talk about it. If you read any of these books, you go to Barnes & Noble, you go to a bookstore, go to Amazon, you see these books written about this stuff. And that's what they're talking about, non-duality. They're talking about that there is the oneness that exists, that the universe is oneness, and all creation is an expression of that oneness. That's a phrase that you hear a lot in spiritual circles, in New Age circles, etc. It's the idea of the non-duality of the subject and the object. So the subject is what? It's me. It's my mind experiencing. The objects are what? It's what I refer to in my book and some of my lectures as the XYZs of life, quote unquote. XYZs. It's the objects of experience, the words we're speaking, the hands that we're seeing that are moving around on your screen, the ideas in our mind, the emotions we have, the people we're with, the relationships we have. All of those are the changing XYZs of life. And then there's the subject that's experiencing, the mind that's experiencing. But in non-dualism, the thinking is that the subject is all that is, and the objects are just an expression of the subject. The non-dualism thinking is that in reality, there are no objects of experience. It's all subjectivity. That's this idea of non-dualism. Okay, let's talk about this. Let's take this apart. Let's unbundle it, unpack it a little bit, and think about it from a common sense standpoint, okay? So why do spiritual teachers preach this whole idea of non-dualism? And it's typically spiritual teachers. They could be religious from a structured, religion like Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, pick one of the major religions in the world, Islam and so forth. The spiritual teachers often, or even non-organized religion, but spiritual teachers often talk about this. They preach this idea of non-dualism, oneness with the universe, oneness with God, oneness with this idea of the absolute. They talk about this idea of dying. So if you believe in reincarnation in the Vedic tradition, the idea is you merge with the oneness. Or in Christianity, you go to heaven and that's it. You're there for eternity. There are schools of Christianity that believe that. So that's all merging. That's what I call merging. And they sometimes explicitly refer to this as merging with this oneness. There's a certain, we'll get to reasons why I think that exists and why people are attracted to it. But suffice it to say that those thinkings exist out there. And for my purposes in discussing with you at this point, what I want to point out is my thinking, my perspective on this is I think that they don't fully understand how our minds exist. They don't understand how our minds operate, and they don't understand and when I say mind, I'm referring also to our soul or consciousness, awareness. I'm not just referring to the mind that's making decisions all the time. I'm talking about our expanded sense of self, our expanded mind, but still our mind that's experiencing. All right. I don't think they fully understand the expansiveness of our mind, the potential of our mind to be fully conscious in a way that's very, very, very different from our walking around when we're awake state of mind. All right. I think people are, those of you who know me, you hear me lecture, I always say, as compared to what? I say that all the time because it is in life as compared to what? We need to have perspective on things. And so what are people often talking about who jump to the conclusion when they feel connection, a connection with something that seems bigger than themselves? They immediately jump to this oneness, this non-dualism argument and interpretation. Why? I think is because there's a lack of full understanding of the extensiveness of the mind, of their own mind. And so when they experience something that seems larger than their usual sense of experiencing of walking around with their eyes open waking state, there's immediate jump. There's a jump to, oh, that must be God. Oh, that must be divine. Oh, I must be experiencing oneness with the universe. There's this immediate jump to non-dualism. All right? And whole conferences and huge movements exist on the planet espousing this whole idea of non-dualism. I think it's because essentially there's a lack of experience on the individual parts who are engaged in that with the fullness, with the complete fullness of their minds. So they jump to something. It must be other than me, because the way they define me, in other words, where they define themselves in that situation, from my perspective, is limited. And even if they're meditators, they're still defining their sense of self in terms of the experience they have during their meditations, which may be somewhat expanded, but still somewhat limited. And so I think that my experience has been over the last 45 years, and I've been meditating for 45 years, and I've been involved in self-awareness and my own personal self-development for many thousands of years, at least 6,000 years that I can remember. And I've shared this personal thought with you before. But I think as we grow in our familiarity with ourselves, we see how, from a personal experience standpoint, how expansive our minds can be, and how dualism does not necessarily have to negate this idea of connectedness. So that's where the rubber meets the road for most people. They feel like they need to make a jump when they feel such incredible level of connection with that which is not them, that which is not themselves, that they feel like they have to make a jump to this oneness argument. And I say, no, you don't have to. You can if you want to, but you don't have to, because connection does not mean oneness. Connection does not mean sameness. It's kind of analogous to, you think about the ocean. The ocean is made up of zillions, who knows, multiple trillions of particles of water. One could say that all those particles of water have a similarity to each other, arguably even a sameness with each other. So that an incredible connectedness with each other, all those particles of water. But each of those particles of water is not the ocean. It is part of the ocean, but it is not the ocean. There's a similarity, arguably a sameness in terms of how they're structured, but not, they are not the ocean. Analogously, we are similar to each other. Our minds may be similar. I would argue there's not a sameness with each mind, but the point from the analogy, the ocean analogy, is that our minds may experience that connectedness, that connection with each other, and with inanimate objects as well, a connection, a connectedness. But that does not equate to sameness. That does not equate to oneness, meaning sameness. So why do people conflate that? Why do we confuse that connectedness with sameness or oneness? I think there's basically two reasons. One is an individual sense of loneliness. That when people feel spiritually insecure, or just personally insecure, quite frankly, it breeds a spiritual insecurity. What I call it, that's my phrase that I've come up with, maybe others have used it too, but I call it spiritual insecurity. And you can go on my website, and I've written an article, an essay, a short essay, a 2-page essay about spiritual insecurity, which I won't get into at this point. But it's this need for connection, and we jump to this idea of sameness and oneness out of an insecurity, a loneliness, a feeling of separateness, which is resolved by turning within. We get rid of we deal with this experience of separateness. How? By connecting with ourselves. That's the key. Not connecting with something external to ourselves, but something within ourselves, our own sense of self. And that's this whole idea of turning within, which I have talked about with you many, many times, and which we do when we meditate. That's the ultimate turning within. And so by turning within, we connect with ourselves, and we feel more self-centered. We feel more self-sufficient. We feel more centered. We feel more self-confident. And that inner strength mitigates this feeling of loneliness and dissipates it and makes it disappear. It goes away, right? The second reason why I think this source of confusion about non-dualism has arisen is more institutional. And I think that certain institutions have arisen from Vedic, Judeo-Christian, various other religious and spiritual institutions have talked about this merging that I alluded to earlier, this merging with God, this merging with this oneness. And there was this thinking that occurred thousands of years ago through these spiritual traditions where they thought, they compared notes and they thought, well, I experience this connection. So do I. You know, these these ancient spiritual teachers, ancient in terms of history. Excuse me. And so they said, hey, I experienced this oneness. Whoa, I experienced this oneness, this connectedness. Well, it must be oneness. And so, and we must merge when we die, when we experience enough level of enlightenment. When we are enlightened, we will merge with this absolute. We will merge with this oneness. But go to 30thnovember.com if you haven't already, and listen to my friend George Hammond. We've known each other since he was 17, I was 20 years old at Dartmouth when we were undergraduates. But he got some interesting information from the other side, we'll call it, and go hear what he has to say about it and what those ancient, those historical spiritual leaders have said and come full circle in terms of their self-disclosure about what their experience really was, that they have not merged, that their individuality has continued. And so as a result, there's a new paradigm that's come out, and I'll just kind of give you a summation of it because we're getting to the end of our hour now together. But you can hear me talk more about this on other webinars. But there's this new paradigm, and the whole idea is that the mind is eternal. The individual mind is eternal. The soul, the consciousness, awareness, however you want to define mind, is eternal. It is not created, not destroyed. It is indestructible, and it will continue forever. This is our consciousness. This is our mind, our soul, however you want to define that. Continues. And it continues in its individuality. So whenever you hear people talk about a feeling of connection, and I talked about this last month, this experiencing of eternity idea, and you can go and listen to that in greater detail. I unbundle that whole experience and talk about that. So you can go listen to the archive where I talk about that. But this idea is, it's always an individual. It's always we're experiencing that. And if we're experiencing that, then that must mean our individuality is continuing, right? We're not merging with some oneness. If we are experiencing oneness, it's we are experiencing. See, so we are not the ocean. It's we are still experiencing ourselves as drops of water. If we say, I'm experiencing this oneness with nature. I'm experiencing this oneness with God. However, oneness with the universe. I'm experiencing this oneness with the universe. I'm still experiencing that. That means my individuality still exists. So I've coined this term. I call it the sovereignty of our mind. Our minds are sovereign. They're unique to ourselves. They are individual, indestructible, sovereign entities unto themselves. Each of our minds. And there's trillions of minds that exist on our planet today. Never mind who knows what exists on other planets. But on our planet alone, there are trillions of minds that exist. There are billions of human minds, and there are many animal minds and other minds that exist on our planet today, on Earth. So in each of them is a sovereign mind, a sovereign entity in and of itself. A third principle is the principle of free will in this new paradigm, that free will always operates. Things are not predestined. There's nothing that's been figured out, and we're not playing in some game that somebody is pulling some strings on. No, we all have free will. And next month, I'm going to talk about this idea of destiny. And I'll preview that for you in a second. But free will operates all the time. And fourth principle I want to say in today's discussion with is that we need to appreciate our independence and our interconnectedness. So we are independent, free will thinking minds. And yet at the same time, there is an interconnectedness amongst all of us, all of the minds that exist in creation. Absolutely, that exist in the universe. And throughout the universe, we can experience this interconnectedness and at the same time experience our individuality. It's not the same as oneness or sameness. This idea of non-dualism, I think, bottom line, inadvertently promotes suffering. Because what happens? It promotes suffering in the following way. People aspire to experiencing this non-dualism, this oneness, this merging of their individuality with the universality is the phrase they use sometimes. Well, that is always beyond what I call the imagination horizon of the individual, right? It's important for us to live in the present. In the present is between now and our imagination horizon. The imagination horizon is everything after that is what we imagine. It's not our experience now. It's what we might want it to be. And so if we might want it to be, we're always searching and seeking this merging with the universality or the oneness or however they call this. That is always beyond our imagination horizon. What that does is it puts us always not living in the present, always not living in the continual present. The continual present is where we do live. Now, in effect, the person is always living in their continual present because that's all that we do live in. But my point is their desire, their part of their mind is always desirous of something outside, beyond their imagination horizon, and that's what creates suffering. This discord between being in the moment, being in the continual present, living our lives fully now, and thinking, being either in the past or the future. Future as defined, I call it living on the other side of that imagination horizon. That's what creates suffering. So in my mind, using a common sense approach to this whole idea of non-dualism and dualism, this idea of dualism has inadvertently led to suffering in the world, suffering in people, in minds, in the way they perceive themselves and think. So again, thanks for joining. What about egolessness? Didn't the Buddha say that a belief in solid self is a cause of suffering? See, that's a conflation. That is exactly what I'm talking about. Buddha has conflated that. Buddha has confused that. And if you go listen to 30thnovember.com, you'll hear the derivation of this confusion. And so the derivation of the confusion was well-intentioned. It was to help remove suffering, but that's why I use the word inadvertently. It inadvertently, not intentionally, but it inadvertently has created suffering in the world. Because as far as we know, Buddha, John the Baptist, Jesus, Shankara, all the great spiritual teachers throughout human history, anyway, have not merged. They have not merged and lost their sense of self with what Buddha refers to as the non-self, as you say. That has not occurred. And as far as anybody who's been around on the planet for hundreds of thousands of years, seeking spiritual developing themselves spiritually, we'll call it, no one has merged with this non-self or this absolute concept. Everybody's individuality has continued. And that's why I'm talking about this new paradigm of the individual mind being eternal, and there being this free will, this freedom that continues throughout eternity. And eternity, as I defined last time, again, I don't want to get into it again, but you can go back and listen to the archive of how I talked about eternity last time. So I hope this has helped. And then next month's session is going to be on, again, the first Sunday of every month, so August 7th. And I'm going to be talking about the idea of destiny. Is it destiny? What is destiny? And what if I can make choices before I'm born? Because sometimes you may have heard of stories of little kids coming in and telling their parents, well, I saw you in this hotel, blah, 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 blah. And it turns out the parents were in that hotel. I tell this one of these stories in my book about a kid who was conceived about 6 weeks, I think 6 weeks after the parents went on a vacation to that hotel. And the kid talks about choosing his parents and checking them out and so forth. So what about that? What if we could make that kinds of choices? I mean, whether you believe in that or not doesn't matter. But what if we can make these kinds of choices before we're born? Does that mean that we have destiny, that we have set things up, set the board game, so to speak, BOARD, board game? Have we set that up beforehand? And does that mean that we have a destiny and that things are predetermined and kind of figured out beforehand? We're going to talk about that. We're going to unbundle this idea of destiny next month in our discussion. Okay? So again, have a great month. Great to see you guys again. Those of you who are listening to the archive video of this, I'm glad you could get, benefit from it, hopefully. It helps you in terms of your own spiritual development, your own personal development. That's my whole point of all of this stuff. You don't have to believe what I'm saying. You can take 5%, 10%, 50% of what I'm saying, whatever part of it helps you move forward. That's my objective. Okay. So we'll see you again next month. Have a great month. And anybody has any questions, whether it's about our discussion today about non-dualism and dualism, or whether it's about your meditation, feel free, you know how to reach me, send me an email, text me, whatever, and then we can continue the conversation over the next month. Okay? So, great. Thanks for joining. We'll talk to you again in a month. Take care.